Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this important and obviously timely webinar on recent events in Syria. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the President and CEO of the Pacific Council on International Policy, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. As many of you are aware, Syria remains a focal point of international attention, not only because of its geopolitical significance, but also due to the profound humanitarian, political, and security challenges that continue to unfold there. Over the past decade, Syria has been transformed from a country of cultural richness and historical depth to a complex theater of conflict with implications that extend far beyond its borders. Today's session will explore the most recent developments shaping the situation in Syria, including the flight of President Assad to Russia. We'll discuss issues such as what happens now that the rebel forces have taken over the country, the humanitarian crisis that continues to affect millions of displaced Syrians, and international responses to these challenges. Additionally, we obviously will be aware and cognizant of how global power rivalries and shifting alliances are influencing the future trajectory of Syria. Understanding these events is critical not only for policymakers and analysts, but for all of us who care about stability, human rights, and peace in the region. With Syria at the crossroads of the Middle East, its trajectory has significant implications for global security, refugee movements, and international law. Today's webinar will help us to unpack these issues and more, and will explore what the future might hold for the country and its people. Our expert guest today is Aaron David Miller, who will provide an overview of the recent developments in Syria and analyze the implications for the US and the region in the context of change in government here in the United States. A few words about Aaron. It's my distinct honor to have him here today. He has decades of experience at the highest levels of diplomacy, policy analysis, international relations. Mr. Miller is a leading voice in understanding the complexities of global politics, particularly in the Middle East. He served as a U.S. State Department Middle East analyst, negotiator, and advisor for over 2 decades across both Republican and Democratic administrations. His efforts are focused on some of the most challenging and pivotal issues, including Arab-Israeli peace process and broader regional stability. In addition to his government service, Aaron is a prolific writer, commentator, and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His thoughtful and incisive analysis have been featured in leading publications such as The Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and The New York Times. You've probably also seen him many times on major networks like CNN, PBS, and NPR. Aaron David Miller brings a depth of understanding and a nuanced perspective to today's conversation, drawn not only from his professional achievements, but also from his lifelong commitment to fostering dialogue and understanding. Before we begin this webinar in earnest, let me just add one personal note. I had the great pleasure of working alongside Aaron at the Wilson Center for a number of years, and eventually succeeded him as the VP for New Initiatives. But when he was there, Aaron was an incredible colleague, somebody who was supportive, appreciative, in particular of younger colleagues, but in general, he was just extraordinarily generous in his praise for his colleagues. Aaron, I want to say a personal thank you for all that you did for me at the Wilson Center, for helping to form me as a think tanker and also as a leader. So thanks for everything that you've done for me personally. And now let's get this final webinar of the year started. Aaron, you and I in the preparation for this webinar talked a lot about the Syrian exception. And I wonder if you could, first of all, just give us a brief summary of the sort of the highlights of what has been happening in Syria over the past week or so, and then talk about why this is such a difficult situation for us to analyze and to predict what will happen next, because the fact that we really have no precedent of this that hasn't left a worse situation. Over to you.
Thanks, Duncan, so much. And first of all, way too kind, but a word about you. The Pacific Council is fortunate to have you. Your humor, your grace, your sagacity, and your ability to take very complicated developments, unpack them, and make them accessible with insight and wisdom to ordinary humans, I think is one of your more endearing characteristics. And yes, the Wilson Center was a fascinating place to work, and interaction with you, Duncan Wood, was among my greatest pleasures every day. permit me just an observation or two about the general problem. I mean, I would love to fashion myself an expert on the region. I spent a lot of time there, but I guess accurately, I'm an expert on us. I worked for Republican and Democratic administrations. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. I think the challenge in the end is going to be a heavy lift for the United States. We really do face a sort of conundrum in the region. We're caught between a region we cannot transform, Iraq and Afghanistan, the two longest wars in American history, where the standard for victory was never could we win, but when could we leave? And extrication is not the metric you want to use to judge a policy of probably still the most consequential actor on the international stage, the United States. So we're caught between transformation, which we cannot do, and extrication, which American interests cannot abide. So that's the real challenge for me. If we can't transform this region and we can't extricate ourselves from it because we have interest allies and adversaries there, how do we find the balance? And I would say to you that we have not been able in no administration that I worked for, which had been 7 or 8, did we find the balance in war and peacemaking. The one that came closest was the Bush 41, James Baker administration. I mean, I had the honor of working for for former Secretary of State Baker. There was a better effort to find that balance, but that's what's going to confront the Trump administration. Just one other observation on what we know and what we don't know. It's stunning to me that over the course of the last 14 months, the analytical community writ large, including our own intelligence agencies, the think tank community, and just about everybody else, failed to anticipate, in my judgment, two of the most extraordinary events that have succeeded in roiling the region. Number one, October 7 and all that it has wrought. And number two, the speed with which the Assad regime collapsed. I'm not saying that there weren't individuals that pointed to the possibilities that this wasn't going to be, Syria in particular, a frozen conflict. But the fact is nobody saw this coming. Probably not even Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in their initial efforts to expand their control in and around Aleppo, or their Turkish patrons. I think this may well have been an accidental coup. Aleppo fell largely because the Syrian security forces melted away. The Syrians themselves deserve credit here for agency in rising up in cities like Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. But again, I only raise this point because there are, not to quote the late Don Rumsfeld, but there are known knowns, known unknowns, and I think we're going to be in for a great many more surprises as we look at Syria and beyond. Duncan referred to the Syria exception, a term that I coined in allowing my hopes, I think, to get the better of me or get the better of my experiences. And that is, I define it very simple. There is no precedent in the last decade and a half for an Arab authoritarian to be overthrown that has led either to a situation in which there has been less repression and truly functional governance, or a situation in which the countries that authoritarian controlled didn't sort of devolve into dysfunction or state failure. And authoritarians in the Middle East came in two sorts of categories. There were the adversarial authoritarians, Gaddafi in Iraq, with whom the United States was at odds. And then there were the acquiescent authoritarians, Mubarak, Ben Ali, Abdullah Saleh, and the Assads in some respects, with which the United States cooperated. But in none of these cases, when these individuals left the scene, Mubarak was succeeded briefly by a Muslim Brotherhood government. There's more repression in Egypt than clearly any point during the Mubarak regime. In Tunisia, Ben Ali was overthrown, and yet the sprouts of what people thought would be the first Arab democracy sort of turned to the weeds as an autocratic president concentrated power. Gaddafi, in the wake of Gaddafi, Libya remains a deeply divided and dysfunctional country. Abdullah Saleh was killed by the Houthis. Yemen was already a failing state, and the Houthis managed to take over much of it. And then of course, you have Iraq, which may well be the best example, and no one would point to Iraq, I think, as the example of a well-governing, functioning entity. So that's the real question, the real challenge. Will Syria prove to be the exception? The headlines here strike me as reasonably positive. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and by the way, that is not the only element that was responsible for what occurred. You had southern militias in Dera, which was the source of the original Syrian uprising. You have any number of other groups. You have jihadi groups, largely from Iraq and the Caucasus, which the leader, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, now Ahmad Shara, his birth name, is trying to encourage these people to return to Idlib, which HTS governed over the past 5 or 6 years. So HTS is not the only element in a situation which now still is quite fractious. You have the Islamic State emerging in central Syria. Its numbers reduced from the height of its caliphate, now maybe between 3,000 to 5,000, but this year has seen a tripling of its attacks in Syria. ISIS remains a significant problem. Pro-Turkish militias, the SNA, is involved in a very tense series of standoffs and conflict with the SDF, the pro-Kurdish elements that the United States is supporting. So HTS does not control Syria by any means. And I think that's probably to be expected given the fractious nature once the Assads had departed. HTS is sending signals, both in terms of word and deed. They're reaching out to the Alawi communities along the coast. They've allowed Christians in places like Aleppo space to prepare for the Christmas holidays. They've sent positive signals to the Druze. Even the SDF is in touch with HTS. There's been very little retribution and revenge killings. That, I think, is on the positive side of the ledger. On the negative side, it's not yet clear to me whether Ahmad Shara, and by the way, the Nam de Guerre, aka Abu Muhammad al-Julani, his parents were born he was born in Saudi, but his parents were born in the Golan Heights before the Israelis occupied it in 1967. And that the Israeli factor, we can return to this in a minute, is going to be, I think, increasingly important in the equation. HTS, again, it's not clear. Does Ahmad Shara want to be the king or the kingmaker? He's appointed a transitional regime, chosen a colleague, Mohammed Bashir, an engineer, English-speaking, from Idlib to become the prime minister. Most of these appointments have been by appointment. There are no elections. Yeah. And there are those on the ground who are concerned about the aggregation of HTS power, the way it's staffed and appointed its own officials in the ministries, provincial governors. It's seeking to incorporate elements within this Syrian military into a newly aligned security forces. I don't think it's clear yet whether or not the major lift, the major challenge which way it's going to go. And the challenge is this: can an Islamist movement, authoritarian by nature, having separated itself from the transnational terrorism and ideology of both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, can it, having governed in one of the most conservative areas of Syria, Idlib, where it governed functionally, but in many respects harshly, can it extend its control and govern wisely over a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic, now fractious Syria, which has many groups contending for influence and power, and for whom intervention on the part of key actors, the losers so far, the Russians and the Iranians, and the winners, Turkey, potentially the United States, and perhaps the Israelis, although, again, we can come back to that issue. Can they manage the interaction between the internal rebuilding cohesion of a state which is bankrupt, psychologically, in some respects, fractured as an entire generation of Syrians exposed to the abuse of a Captagon drug-infused, exporting, mafia-led regime, the Assad family? Can HTS and whatever governing structure it ultimately creates, can it manage the internal and external pressures that are likely to emerge? And will Syria be the Arab Spring's only exception? That to me is the challenge. And I frankly, neither you, I, or most of the analytical community maybe Syrians themselves have the capacity to answer that question.
You've given us a lot to unpack there, Aaron. I mean, there's the fact that Syria is such an ethnically diverse country, the fact that you have uneven terrain, the fact that you have now a governing party or body rather that is militaristic and has no experience of governing the country. You've outlined a lot of the challenges there. So what needs to happen to change HTS into a governing force rather than just, I guess I'm paraphrasing you here, but an accidental victor in an unexpected overthrow?
I mean, I guess that's the core question, and I think HTS has set up a transitional period, which is supposedly to last till March of 2025. There is an external transition process that the international community ensconced in UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which calls for a transitional, not appointed, a transitional government by consensus, the drafting of a constitution and elections.
Yeah.
I think that situation on the ground is rapidly undermining and perhaps making moot that external and seemingly rational transition process. Syria is going to need a lot of help. And the real question is, who are the actors that are most inclined or most disposed to provide it? And that question, I think, is extremely difficult to answer. Syrian civil war more or less escaped the influence of most of the key regional players and the United States.
Yeah.
Trump 1.0 was prepared to walk away from Syria, but Obama wrestled with this problem as well. The so-called red line that was not enforced for the use of the Assad regime's deployment of chemical weapons against the suburbs of eastern Damascus. I mean, the question of governance, Duncan, is I'd say fortunately or unfortunately tied to the issue of Syria's provision of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction. Right now, HTS is designated as a foreign terrorist organization. The U.S. since the early 70s have deployed a degree of sanctions, with probably, other than North Korea and Russia, make Syria the most heavily sanctioned country in the world today. Those sanctions were applied initially because of Syria's, in the 70s, Syria's policies in Lebanon and its acquiescence and support for terrorism. Since 2011, since the Syrian civil war, they've been deployed largely on the regime and its behavior. Most of those sanctions are done through executive order, and it would just seem to me the Europeans haven't deployed as many. The UN sanctions only apply to Syria's state sponsorship of terror. So it's going to depend, I think, largely on the governing structure that is set up and whether or not the international community is prepared in a serious, comprehensive way to remove sanctions. There are licenses. You saw that in the February 2023 earthquake in Turkey and Syria, where waivers were applied so the United States could send emergency assistance to the victims of that earthquake. But a comprehensive reintegration of Syria into the international system with a kind of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction assistance that is so critically important, that's going to be a tougher lift, and it is going to be inextricably linked with respect to the leverage. Certainly, I won't speak for the United States, but I would venture to say that neither the Biden administration in its waning days nor the incoming Trump administration is going to be eager to lift those sanctions without concrete demonstration that HTS and Ahmad Shara is moving in the right direction. The Turks, on the other hand, in conjunction with the Qataris, see enormous profits to be made through reconstruction. So you could see, presumably, a sort of Turkish first among equals here, sort of evading sanctions and continuing to deal with Syrian reconstruction. But again, I think it's unknown, and I'm not sure I could give you a sequenced menu about what would be necessary. It's going to be a very long movie, but I really do believe it's going to start with the next 3 months. By March of 2025, it'll become maybe a bit clear where HTS and Ahmad Shara as king or kingmaker is headed. You'll also have sorted out to some degree the reality that you have two NATO members, Turkey and the United States, supporting opposition groups who have already engaged and may continue to engage if the Syrians mount a major military operation into Kobani and the area east and west of the Euphrates. That's one of the many ironies, I think, that's going to distinguish this period.
Fantastic. Aaron, we're beginning to get questions coming in from our audience. I'm going to hold off on those for another 10 minutes, but then we'll turn to the audience. So just encourage the folks out there who are watching to send in your questions through the Q&A function. My question builds on something you were just talking about, the role of external powers. You talked extensively about Turkey. Obviously, the Russians continue to maintain a military presence in Syria. We've heard a lot, of course, about the role of Israel in seizing more territory around the Golan Heights, and of course, we can never forget about the influence of Iran. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the most important countries as this post-conflict situation is being shaped. I've been reading a lot in the press, and most in particular through NPR, about the outsized role that Turkey may play in reshaping Syria after Assad. And obviously we've seen the conflict up in the north of the country between Kurdish and Turkish backed forces. and then the recent sort of the ceasefire that has happened there. So I wonder if you could lead us off with Turkey and then talk a little bit about Israel and Iran.
I mean, geography is destiny, right? So those states that have proximate borders with Syria are going to be the ones that are going to have the most interest, economic, security, political interests. I don't know if you mentioned, may have had a mental lapse here. I don't know if you mentioned the Russians in
Yeah,
your,
their military presence continues there. Yeah.
right. Well, so we want to touch on that. Look, I think Turkey has two primary objectives. Erdogan does. Number one is creating space to return or facilitate the return of the roughly 3 million Syrian refugees that now call Turkey home, number one. And number second, I think, not to put too fine a point on it, dealing a crushing blow, if possible, to the armed Kurdish elements.
Yeah.
The Syrian People's Protection Units, the SDF, American-backed SDF. And I think, I'm not sure as I reflect back on it, whether or not Erdogan anticipated the outcome that he initially supported when the HTS on November 27th began their sort of what was going to be ultimately a dash to Damascus. I think he might have preferred a weaker Assad rather than an emboldened and fractious HTS. That remains to be seen. But an Islamist movement ruling in Damascus that Erdogan could control would be a major achievement for him. It raises the question, of course, of Turkey's relations with others and how expansive is and forgiving is Turkey prepared to be with respect to HTS governance. I mean, Erdogan, no Democrat he, would seem to me to be have been willing to give HTS a fairly wide berth as long as they didn't practice the kind of repression that Assad had. Turkey may well, it is the major power broker in the region. There's no question about it. And I think as things play out, the Turks are going to end up having, I would suspect, much rockier relations with the other powers with which they're contending, including the Israelis. And Turkish-Israeli relations have now dropped to perhaps their lowest level in years. Many factors feed that sort of dysfunction. And then, of course, you have an incoming administration. The president-elect, I think, admired Erdogan as a strong leader, but they've had their differences with respect to the deployment of the 900 U.S. forces are in the country and American support for the SDF. But Turkey is the thing, and both in terms of reconstruction, political support, and backing of pro-Turkish Syrian elements, the SNA, is the group that's doing most of the Turkish bidding along the border area. So we'll see. Will the Turks launch a major effort to retake the town of Kobani, which the SDF took back from ISIS in 2016? That'll be a critically important issue here. And how supportive are the Turks going to be of a authoritarian Islamist cast to a government that rules in Damascus? The Iranians clearly suffered a major defeat. This alliance between the Assads and the Islamic Republic of Iran goes back decades. It's a non-ideological alliance in many respects, which is why it has endured. Iran sought depth by creating this bond with the Assads, depth and protection from Sunni encirclement. That's now gone. It strikes me as almost inconceivable that the Iranians will be able to rebuild and restore their influence in Syria. Lately, over the last several months, the axis of resistance of which Assad was a part has been hollowed out largely by Israeli military activities, Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yeah.
The Iranians have seen their sort of strategic triad undermined. The proxies, one leg, their ballistic missile capacity hollowed out, not just by the ineffectiveness of the two strikes they launched against the Israelis in mid-April and again on October 1st, but the Israeli response on October 26th, which basically has left the Syrians without adequate air defense and has destroyed their capacity not just to launch missiles, but to actually some industrial facets and components of the production line in making ballistic missiles. So the Iranians are on their back feet. I think they will. There's one, obviously, leg to the strategic triad that most affects American interests, and that's, of course, the fact that Iran right now is a nuclear weapons threshold state. It within weeks, it could produce enough fissile material for 4 or 5 nuclear weapons, and there are estimates that within 6 months, if undetected, the Iranians could produce at least 1 nuclear weapon. But none of that bears on the current situation. I think Iran's influence, and clearly the regime made a strategic decision, I think in part because they were taken by surprise, which raises serious questions about their own intelligence assessments of the effectiveness or efficiency of Syrian military, that their influence in Syria is clearly going to recede. That leaves the Russians. Putin, I'm sure you heard yesterday, did his best to put a spin on the fact that the Russians also made a decision, it seems to me, that if the Syrian military wasn't going to be able to stand, they were not going to repeat their intervention in 2015, which saved the Assads at a critical point in the Syrian civil war. The Russians, I think, are clearly concerned about their airfield at Himamim, which is a jump-off point for Russian activity throughout the Middle East and into Africa. They're already, I was looking at an Institute for Study of War site, by the way, and that's a pretty good source for day-to-day reads on developments on the ground on a sort of granular level. They're looking at Libya and Sudan as possible alternatives, but they don't have the lift capacity that was made available to them at Himamim and at their warm water port in Tartus. Putin, I think, said that they were still sort of sorting out with the new Syrian government. He almost left you believing that it was up to the Russians whether or not they were going to maintain their bases there. It's hard to believe that the whatever government emerges in Damascus, given the damage the Russians have done, the numbers of Syrians killed in Russian airstrikes, that the HTS or whatever government emerges is going to maintain any sort of close relationship with Putin. I thought at one point that HTS would look at Russia as a sort of counterbalance to Turkey and to the US. And I still wouldn't rule that out. I'll believe it when Himamim and Tartus are formally and officially closed down. That hasn't happened yet. That leaves the Gulf states. The Emiratis, I think, are apoplectic about the fact that you're going to have an Islamist government. They had led the sort of parade over the last several months to try to fashion a mega deal in which Assad would separate himself from the Iranians in exchange for sanctions relief. I have no idea what role the Biden administration played, how serious they were in this enterprise. But the fact, again, I said, I will put myself at the top of the analytical list of people who missed the fall of the Assad regime, that the U.S. And all of its intelligence resources. My friend of 40 years, Bill Burns, CIA director, and this is no slight on Bill or the agency, but the fact that the Biden administration was seriously contemplating that sort of deal, even if they weren't, the main basis of the conclusion was that Assad had won, and that Assad was a keeper, and that Assad would stay. I mean, it's an extraordinary testament to the degree to which everyone seemed to not understand precisely that Syria was not a frozen conflict, that civil wars in the Middle East have a way of quieting down, but then resurging. And as one of my colleagues, Marwan Moasher from Carnegie, put it today in a briefing, the Arab Spring is not yet over. And that raises all kinds of questions for the numbers of authoritarians that currently hold power in key Arab states. Now, that said, the Saudis have a different view, a more flexible view of what's occurred in Damascus. But I think that every Arab authoritarian will have to be looking in the rearview mirror as to what happens with the Syrian exception. Because if, in fact, Syria confounds most of the sort of negative, pessimistic assessments. Remember, it's not the headlines here that are important only, it's the trend lines.
Yeah.
It's where this is going. What if Syria actually does represent the only example so far of an Arab state throwing off the yoke of oppression and repression by an authoritarian? What does that actually say? What could it say for the future of a Middle East, an Arab Middle East, dominated by authoritarian leaders? It's an intriguing question, and as the Brits would say, Duncan, we're a long way from Tipperary on even beginning to answer that question, but it is one of the more intriguing features. And while we're on the subject, I mean, I have to say, I'm very wary of sea changes, watersheds, game changers, and inflection points. And I'm sure there are other words to describe the breathless sort of way in which we tend to greet events. I was told that Russia's invasion of Ukraine would fundamentally change international relations as we know it. Then I was told that COVID would so affect the world that things would be fundamentally different in its wake. Now, things have changed, but fundamentally different. Then October 7th, which was going to somehow rearrange the furniture. And in some respects, it did, but I would only caution, I caution myself every day as I look at the Middle East as a sort of unassembled jigsaw puzzle on my living room floor, and I try to figure out where the pieces go. And the ones that don't seem to fit, I don't cram into place. I put them aside to try to figure out, well, maybe they'll fit better here a week or 6 months or 10 months later. I think we have to be extremely careful and sober about making these judgments. Things change very quickly.
I think that's very good advice. And I think that most of us who have been involved in international affairs analysis for decades have made the mistake many times of saying, well, this is a watershed moment. It turns out that there are very few of them. And in terms of structural change at the systemic level, it very, very rarely happens. So I
Yes.
think good advice there. We've got a lot of questions that are coming in, Aaron. Some of them have been on Turkey, so you've answered those exceptionally well. And thanks to Milena Beric, who's watching from Syria, and from Denise Lubo for questions on Turkey. I do want to ask you a little bit about obviously how the Trump administration is going to view what's happening in Syria. We had the extraordinary example in the first Trump administration of the Abraham Accords, with sort of a new beginning for peace and cooperation in the Middle East. One thing that I have observed with great interest is how there has been such a muted reaction to Israeli actions in Syria in terms of seizing more territory. I wonder if you could sort of answer both of those aspects before we turn to the questions from our audience. How will the Trump administration view this? What are they likely to do? And I know you don't have a crystal ball. And also, what do you see as being the future of the Abraham Accords in spreading a more cooperative feeling throughout the Middle East?
Right. I mean, I'll say this with the greatest amount of, well, it's as partisan a comment, I think. I work for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. The Supreme Court goes in and out of session. The U.S. Congress goes in and out of session. The presidency does not go in and out of session. It is the 24/7, I called it the Energizer Bunny of the American political system. And it is incumbent on the president to ultimately, even though the founders created a system which was an open invitation to struggle between the various branches of government, it's still, when it comes to foreign policy, it's up to the president to define, based on many different factors, a conception of the national interest. And this, to me, which should transcend party politics, ego, financial interests. And this, to me, is the unanswered question about Trump 2.0. Does the president have a clearly defined conception of the national interest? And as it pertains to the region, this region, what are the priorities? I would argue to you that there's a high probability that of all of the pockets of this region, including the one that has seen the most tumult and conflict during the course of the last year and a half, that the incoming administration will be focused primarily on the Gulf. The Gulf is the thing. The Gulf is the thing because it's stable. It escaped the Arab Spring, by and large, for any number of reasons. The Gulf has oil and hydrocarbons. The Gulf has sheikhs, emirs, crown princes, kings that tend to flatter an incoming president. It is no coincidence, by the way, that the first foreign trip that former President Trump took, first one, was not to Canada, not to Mexico, not to Britain. It was to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is emblematic of so many sorts of threads of Trump 1.0. And the Gulf has something else. You referred to the Abraham Accords, which have weathered this storm, frankly, in a way that sometimes I feel is head exploding. It is extraordinary to me that key Arab states, including Israel's two treaty partners, and there are reasons for this as well, Egypt and Jordan, but leave them out of it because geography is destiny, and there are reasons that neither the Jordanians nor the Egyptians would want to break relations with the state of Israel over the Netanyahu government's prosecution of the war against Hamas in Gaza and the exponential rise. Even if you deduct the 17,000 fighters that the Israelis believe they've killed, 17 to 20,000, you're still talking about, since the Gaza Ministry of Health doesn't distinguish between combatants and non, you're still talking about almost 30,000 Gazans, mostly civilians. Now, it is extraordinary to me that none of the Abraham Accord partners, neither the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, the would-be Saudis at some point, the Moroccans, even froze programs of cooperation. Bahrainis did in the early weeks of the war.
Yeah.
But that subsided. And what it reflects, it seems to me, is a reordering of priorities, which gets to your question of the Abraham Accords, reordering of priorities in the region for the Gulf states. The Palestinian issue, even now, despite all of the exponential rise of Palestinian deaths, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the absence of day after planning in Gaza, that you've seen almost no reaction, again, by the Arab authoritarians. And the Arab street controlled and repressed in both the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and less so in Bahrain, may harbor all kinds of animosities, but it has not impacted. In fact, the Biden administration, even now, is toying with the idea of a bilateral package, including a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia, something we have not concluded with any other country since the revision of the 1960 U.S.-Japan Treaty. Think about that. Yeah. And they want Senate ratification as part of the possibility of an Israeli-Saudi normalization process. I've gotten off the highway here, but I'll come back by saying, in my judgment, Donald Trump, more than anything else, wants, and I mean this seriously, wants a Nobel and wants an Israeli-Saudi normalization agreement. And ironically, it may well be, depending on how things sort out, that he might be in a position to bring the kind of leverage on the Israelis to produce what Mohammed bin Salman, aka MBS, needs in order to do that deal. Now, I say that it's a throwaway, but what is not a throwaway, I think, is the Trump administration's determination to focus on the Gulf. Yeah. Both their financial interests, the political interests, everything points to the Gulf. Does not point to fixing Syria, maintaining the ceasefire in Lebanon. That's in an Israeli Hezbollah interest. I think that will probably be maintained almost by not because it is in the vital interests of both the Netanyahu government and Hezbollah and the Iranians to maintain that ceasefire. So the Abraham Accords are alive. I'm not sure they're particularly well, but that'll be a focus, I think, of the next administration's policy.
Thank you, Aaron. And for our audience, I just want to give them a heads up that on January 22nd at 8 a.m. Pacific, we'll be hosting an event with my predecessor at the Pacific Council, Jerry Green, on the future of U.S. Middle East policy under the Trump administration, a chance to revisit a lot of these broader questions about the region. Let me turn right now, Aaron, to some of the questions that have been coming in. As I said, we had a number of questions on Turkey. We've got a follow-up one, which I'll come to in a second. But one that from Madeline Blidaru, what would be the responsibilities of the international community on dealing with the issue of various weapons of mass destruction, given internal and external risks to peace and security in circumstances related to the conflict between factions? And if I can, I'm going to piggyback on that. You've already mentioned Captagon. You and I used to have long conversations about narco states in Latin America. It was something that most of us weren't aware of, was how much revenue the Assad regime was generating from the Captagon trade. Some estimates up to sort of $10 billion. What happens with that illicit commodity at this point in time as well?
I mean, Captagon's a huge problem, right? I mean, created by a German company in the early 60s is a methamphetamine. And it's not just used by a narrow slice of Middle East constituencies. Because it suppresses appetite and increases mental alertness and acuity, it is the drug of choice by ordinary Middle Easterners, students, cab drivers, anyone who does shift work, and of course by jihadis, because it also has a numbing effect. And I mean, the Assads were making anywhere from what, I think the figures were over $2.5 billion a year. And the Assad regime was using Captagon as a lever to break out of its isolation by promising the Gulf states that Assad would control the distribution. Huge problem in Saudi Arabia because of the nature of the market, and Jordan. Now, there have been reports, it shouldn't surprise anyone, that HTS had looked the other way for some of their own entrepreneurs with respect to Captagon, but it's hard to imagine that even in a regime like HTS, or a new government led by HTS, that they'd be able to visibly and comprehensively participate in the Captagon trade the way the Assads did. So I think that problem will hopefully become less acute. As far as chemicals, I mean, it's in some respects a mystery. Much of the stocks that the Assads had deployed, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, UN organization, did yeoman's work in cataloging and destroying much of the Assad stock, but and the Israelis, of course, have claimed to have, of the 400 plus targets they've hit in Syria over the last 3 or 4 weeks, they claim to have targeted chemical weapon sites. But I think we should look at this in a sort of very cautionary way. It's hard for me to believe that somewhere there are not significant stocks of sarin and chlorine. Now, the fact that there are stocks means that there's a security risk problem. It's hard for me to believe HTS would actually, in an effort to consolidate control over the country, use chemicals. That's not going to happen. But one of the reasons I think that the next administration will not delist and they will not be in a hurry to waive all of sanctions is that sanctions will be, and I say this with great reluctance because ordinary Syrians have suffered greatly, but must be the lever that the internet, not just the United States, that the international community has to use in order to test and guide a new government in Syria in the right direction. Otherwise, I mean, it's hard. I mean, you can seek waivers to deal with humanitarian assistance. I think that will be done, and maybe a general license will be sought on the part of the United States so it can participate, even while some of these sanctions remain in place. But as they did during the Turkey-Syrian earthquake. But I think chemicals will be high on the list, I would think, as the international community tries to develop a set of metrics that I'm not even sure how to even describe it. The new governing authority in Syria well, we'll have to respond to.
Thank you. A question from one of our anonymous watchers. What is the position of China on these developments? How much influence does it have in Syria?
Um, I mean, I think we've completely overestimated China's influence in the region at large. I think economically and in terms of high tech, the Chinese are investing an enormous amount, particularly in the Gulf.
Yeah.
I can't see, I mean, Syria is a basket case. I mean, could you anticipate uh, China looking to develop contracts for reconstruction? Uh, how would the Chinese comport themselves when it came to abiding by sanctions? It's a very good question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I'd throw out that Chinese role here is going to be, of all the external powers seeking to meddle for reasons good and bad, I think China will play a not much of a role.
Yeah, I mean, just as a non-expert, what I've observed of China in the region is that they have largely kept out of the more messy aspects of the Middle East,
And that's,
focusing on
that's
questions.
precisely the point. They love holding meetings in Beijing to reconcile PLO groups. And I could see that happening as well. But, you know, the Chinese don't want, they just don't want to play the role that the United States has played because
That's
guess what? You want to be a peace mediator? Guess what? From
right.
personal experience, you're going to make a lot of people angry. And that's not something the Chinese want to do. They can have relations with everyone, right? The Syrians, the Israelis,
Absolutely.
PLO, Hamas.
A follow-up question I promised on Turkey from Gitanjali Patak. If Turkey is potentially a major player in Syria, what happens to the Kurds who are hitherto backed by the US but are regarded as enemies by Turkey? You've talked a little bit about the Kurds in your earlier comments, but what do you think is the future for the Kurds and also that question of, will the United States continue to support them?
Yeah. I mean, 900 American troops in Syria, deemed by an unidentified, I'll keep this person, unidentified National Security Council official as temporary, transitional, and temporary, transactional, and transitional. This is the way our support for the SDF was regarded. And yet here we are. We have several bases along the Jordanian-Iraqi border. They're there largely to assist the SDF to gather intelligence. The SDF doesn't have air power or the intelligence capacities that we do. I wrote a piece, someone painfully reminded me uh, several years ago that Trump administration actually was onto something, considering redeploying or withdrawing 900 American troops from Syria. I'd forgotten about that because I just didn't see the utility under the Assads. I mean, they were there presumably also as a symbol that we weren't going to surrender the field to the Iranians. Well, I mean, that's really, given the nature of the Iran's relationship with Syria, intensive, comprehensive, we couldn't and didn't do much there. Um, I think the if I were briefing the president-elect and they asked me, do you think you should pull the 900 troops? I would say absolutely not. And I would basically appeal to the president-elect's own vanity by basically saying you cannot afford. ISIS is making a resurgence. They've tripled their number of attacks during 2024. Uh, we have a very important counterterrorism mission to play. Even if you're not interested in adopting a significant role in trying to diplomatically and moving the Syrian government in the right direction, that those 900 forces need to continue to be deployed counterterrorism mission. Um, whether whether that will remain the case, I don't know. Um, I don't think Syria is going to be a major component of the Trump administration's Middle East policy. Certainly not in terms of providing financial assistance, economic aid for sure. And we shouldn't. We're not in a position, the Gulf states, regional parties clearly have to step up.
Yeah.
And they haven't, by the way, in Syria for many, many years. And again, I think for the Trump administration, without a clear conception of the national interest, I think the focus of Trump's policy will be on the Gulf for the reasons that I've identified. By the way, Duncan, I would just make one comment. One of the hardest things over the years I spent in government was identifying what American interests really are. And that's, we talk about a policy. All policy is a way to describe a process to protect interests. And I would, and again, people will disagree, I would divide our interest in the Middle East into what I call the must-haves, and it would be nice to haves. The must-haves all relate to American security and prosperity. That's protection of the homeland, counterterrorism here and in the region. It's access to hydrocarbons and oil, not because we need them, we need it because oil trades in a single market and there are implications for disruption. And then number three, preventing the emergence of a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon. Those are what I would describe to as the must-haves. Now, that does not suggest that it would be nice to haves. Solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, promoting better governance, respect for human rights, furtherance of participatory governance. All of these are important, but what I have learned over the course of the last 40, 50 years of watching this region and playing a part is that it's littered, literally, with the remains of great powers who thought wrongly they could impose their will on smaller ones. There are times, Duncan, I'm telling you, I feel like we're some sort of modern day Gulliver, wandering around in a part of the world we don't understand, tied up by tiny and large powers whose interests are not our own, and burdened by our own illusions. And I'm not calling for extrication. I believe in American leadership in this region. We just have to be very prudent, wise, and focused on what we can do, what we can support, and what we can't achieve.
Thank you, Aaron. In typical fashion, we're getting in, a couple of questions at the very end here, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. You gave, you gave some comments on the geopolitics of oil in those final remarks that you made, and so Alan, I hope that gave you some idea of what we're doing. And there was a follow-up question on Turkey about the chances of a significant military move into the Kurdish-controlled area of Syria. What I wanted to say, Aaron, is first of all, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and your insights. Second of all, for our audience who have had who've had their appetites whetted by this conversation, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific, you'll be hosting a conversation with leading experts through Carnegie, right?
Charles Lister, who's just back from Syria, and Sanam Vakil, who's at Chatham House, will be calling in from London, and she's very good on the external powers. So I think it'll be a very good session. And Charles's member Ground Truth briefings, Duncan, at the
Yes, of course.
Charles's Ground Truth will be really good, and I think he's just back today, actually.
That'll be fascinating.
And again, it lives on YouTube. You don't have to get up at 7 a.m. to watch it.
Wonderful.
Not that 7 a.m. is an early hour for us Washingtonians. It's not.
Thank you, Aaron. And listen, I want to say that the Pacific Council is always open to collaborations with you and your colleagues. We had a question from Denise here. Can we provide info to join tomorrow's conversation on YouTube? We'll make sure that we can make that available to you, Denise. Just write to me and I'll send you a response on that. Aaron, thank you so much for doing this today. I look forward to seeing you in person in Washington very soon, and we'd love to have you back very soon on.
Duncan, was great. The fringe benefit of this briefing is that you and I reconnected.
Absolutely.
And that's important.
Man. Happy holidays. Happy holidays to all of our viewers as well. And we will reconnect in the new year. All the best.
Take care.
Cheers.